Hello, we are Steve and Tracy Junker. Today we will be replacing a fuel pressure regulator on a 1993 Dodge Grand Caravan with a 3.3 liter engine. This van sometimes has had a long crank time when it has been driven and sat for only a short time. When it does start, it idles roughly for a while, then clears up and runs okay.
Today, we will be replacing a fuel pressure regulator on a 1993 Dodge Grand Caravan with a 3.3 liter engine. This van sometimes has had a long crank time when it has been driven and sat for only a short time. When it does start, it idles roughly for a while, then clears up and runs okay. We warmed it up earlier so that you would be able to hear what it sounds like when it has a long crank time. This problem was diagnosed as a faulty fuel pressure regulator. Only basic tools are needed for this job. We need battery terminal pliers or channel lock pliers, the nitrile gloves, safety goggles or glasses, some towels, socket wrench or nut driver, plastic tool, and some clean engine oil. We will also be changing the oil after replacing the regulator because the oil has been contaminated with the gasoline. So we also have the oil filter here. Remember to allow the shop towels that are contaminated with gasoline to dry completely in a well-ventilated area before disposing of them. Also make sure your work area is free of flames and sparks. The regulator was determined to be at fault after confirming that the air cleaner filter does not need to be replaced. Spark plugs are within spec and the fuel filter is not plugged. We can hear the fuel pump engage during the long crank, so we know the fuel pump is working. To confirm the diagnosis, Steve will carefully pull the vacuum line off the fuel pressure regulator. With the rag below it, he can show you that there is fuel coming from the regulator at the vacuum line to confirm that the fuel pressure regulator is at fault. As you can see, we saw some fuel actually squirting out of the fuel pressure regulator when he cycled the key. First, the fuel pressure must be relieved in order to work safely with the fuel system. Steve is going to disconnect the battery, the negative battery cable, using the battery terminal pliers. The channel lock pliers can also be used instead. We want to isolate the cable, so Steve is just going to wrap it in a rag. Next, he's going to loosen the gas cap. For the last step, Chilton DIY refers the reader to the use of a special tool. We don't have that tool, so we're going to use a shop rag and a plastic tool, a sacrificed corn cob holder in this case. Steve is removing the cover, Steve has already removed the cover from the fuel pressure test port. Using the plastic tool and a rag, Steve is going to open the Schrader valve and capture any fuel that might come out. This is the final step to relieving the fuel pressure. Now it's safe for him to go ahead and remove the fuel pressure regulator. The first thing Steve will be doing is removing the retaining screw using a nut driver. Try to zero in on that so that you can see it a little more carefully. This usually isn't tightened down too extreme, so you don't need to use a lot of pressure to get it off. Next, he's going to remove the retaining clip, and now the fuel pressure regulator itself It's important to look at the old regulator to make sure that the plastic spacers and the O-rings are still attached to the old one. If the O-rings aren't still on it, then they're still down in the housing. Carefully remove those so that you don't mar up the housing. Okay. Now Steve is just cleaning up the housing a little bit so that the new regulator won't be contaminated right away. Steve's going to use a little bit of clean oil that he's put in that cap to lubricate the O-rings before putting the new O-rings down into the housing and seating them. The O-rings were actually on the regulator, but it's safer to remove the O-rings from the new regulator, lubricate them, and put them in the housing before trying to seat the new regulator. This way the O-rings won't be rolled out of place during the installation. Now Steve's going to install the new regulator. Once it's firmly seated, Steve is going to put the retaining clip back on. And then the retaining screw. Next, he's going to put the vacuum hose back on. Next, he'll put the cover back on the test port. You need to protect the Schrader valve. Then attach the negative battery cable. Then before starting it, he'll also replace the gas cap. After allowing the vehicle to get up to temperature on a test drive, Steve will turn it off and allow it to sit for a few minutes, then check the vacuum hose again. He'll then restart it to ensure it starts properly. Here we have a video of the fuel pressure regulator. It's on Chilton DIY. As you can see, the fuel is supposed to go in through the inlet and then out to the return line. This is the port where the vacuum hose is attached, and as you can see, no fuel is actually supposed to be going out that port. That's how we knew that the fuel pressure regulator was faulty. It's also important to remember that after the battery has been disconnected from any vehicle with fuel injection, the control module has to go through a relearn process. This usually means the vehicle may perform differently for a short time. For other projects you can do at home, please go to www.chiltondiy.com. Thank you.